Assalamu alaikum. So in this video I will be speaking about my revert story. For those of you who haven't seen me on TikTok, basically I was born Jewish to a Jewish family and I converted to Islam in 2018. So I get asked a lot of how I converted to Islam, of course, as most reverts get this question. So in this video I'll get into it. So, as I mentioned, I was born to a Jewish family. I was born in Montreal, Canada, to actually a Hasidic family. So, up until I was 3 or 4 years old, up until my parents' divorce, I was raised Hasidic. And afterwards, once my parents got divorced, my mother took me and my siblings out of the Hasidic community, but we still remained Jewish, of course, and we still remained in the Jewish community. So, just a little background. My father is Ashkenazi Jewish. He is from Eastern. His family comes from Eastern Europe, and my mother is Mizrahi and Sephardic. And that means her mother was born in Morocco, and her father was born in Yemen. And my mother was actually born in occupied Palestine, or as Jewish people call it, Israel. So growing up, I always considered myself Israeli, Jewish, Moroccan, Yemeni, Ashkenazi, all of the above, but definitely was held very close to my Jewish ethnicity, and still today I do consider myself Jewish ethnically, which people sometimes have difficulty understanding, but I still consider myself as an ethnic Jew who is religiously Muslim. I saw this one video about debates between Muslims and Jews, and I started realizing at that point that Islam and Judaism are so similar. It was also at that point that I realized that Jews and Muslims believe in the same God, and also Christians, but that's not really relevant to the story. But up till now, to this point, I basically thought that Muslims worshipped a different God. They worshipped Allah, which is a different God. And I realized that Allah is actually just the name for God in Arabic, just like, Dieu is Arabic and French. So I was like, okay, they believe in the Torah, they believe in the Gospels, they believe in all of the Jewish prophets that, Jews believe in. And the only thing that they believe in more is the Prophet Jesus and the Prophet Muhammad as the seal of the prophets, and the Quran as the word of God. So basically that's the only addition that it has to over Judaism. And I also, while I was Jewish, was like, oh yeah, Muslims stole our texts. They're just reusing, they're copying our texts. That's really what I believed. And I realized that it wasn't copying Jewish texts. It was literally the same God. So God was continuing his message. It's the same message. And it just has, I guess, some new information, some new tweaks. And I explained it to myself as it's like an update. People don't like when I use that term, but in my head I was like, it's like an update to Judaism. So at that point I was like, okay, it's not a whole different thing. And I decided to actually start looking to Islam. And also when I was thinking about when I was reading the Tehillim, and I realized that he was saying, well, we prostrate in prayer to God, I did actually think of Muslims. So I was like, okay, that makes sense why Muslims pray to God. Pray to God, in the way they do with prostration, because that's what God wanted. That's what God says. And that's how Jews were praying up until a certain point, until the rabbis came along and said, we don't pray this way anymore. And I also remember, how Muslims pray without their shoes on, and I was like, that makes sense, because a mosque is a holy ground. When you pray when you speak to God, you're speaking to someone so holy, so you have to respect them and take off your shoes. And I thought of, the time when Moses spoke to God and in the burning fire, the Snebo el Ba'esh. I'm not sure exactly what it's called in English, but it's the fire, and God said, please take off your shoes to speak to me, to address me. And this was holy ground, so he had to take off his shoes. And I was like, that makes sense. And it was little things like this. At this point I still was not actually considering being Muslim, but it was little things like that kept being added into I kept realizing that I was like, okay, Islam makes sense, this makes sense. Until one point I was like, you know what, I'll read the Quran. And I started reading the Quran, and the Quran made sense. And I was like, there's nothing wrong with it. It's perfect. But at that point, I still wasn't fully, convinced I'm going to change my religion, because I felt like the thing that was holding me back most was honestly, I felt like I'd be abandoning all of my cultures, all of my traditions, everything that I once believed in would be like completely gone, just because, like, I'm changing my religion, and my religion was a fundamental part of me, of who I was. And I had a really hard time, drifting, like separating myself from that, and, accepting Islam. But at some point I realized that actually, accepting Islam and being Muslim and practicing Islam would actually make me a better Jew. And I wasn't separating myself from Judaism. It was the same God. I was still being, you know, it was still the same religion as the God of Judaism. So I came to realize that at some point. And it was just over time, like I said, many little things that I learned about Islam that made sense to me, even the modesty, and, how the modesty of, like, how Muslims dress. It made sense to me. And I'm like, my whole life, modesty made sense to me because I was raised Jewish, and it just all made sense to me. And I can't exactly remember what was the last drop that made me Muslim, but I do remember when I decided basically to become Muslim. It was Ramadan. It was 2017, and I was like, you know what, I'm gonna do Ramadan just want to see what it's like, So I was like, I'll do it. And as a Jew, I had fasted for like Yom Kippur, so it was like 25 hours for Yom Kippur. So I'm like, yeah, I can do this. And I was able to do this. And I was like, you know what, I want to fully immerse myself in it, so I'm gonna like pray too. So, subhanallah, I actually learned to pray like really quickly. And I remember that I think it's in the Quran, or it says that, God made this language easy for you to understand. And I was like, subhanallah, I was able to learn to pray so quick, and I never had even spoken Arabic. All I knew was like shukran and salam, like, honestly. So it was in January 26, 2018 that I actually converted to Islam. I took my Shahada, and that's when I consider myself fully Muslim. And yeah, that was pretty much it, how I went from being Jewish to being Muslim.